Good morning. Welcome to Dreamforce Day 3. You all look like you had fun last night, right? Am I right? I mean, it's almost empty. Okay, so this introduction to batch and asynchronous Apex. My name is Luis Campos Guajardo. I work for Salesforce on the tooling API team, and I've been doing Salesforce development on the platform for a little bit more than 8 years. So first things first, our safe harbor statement. We might talk about some forward-looking stuff, so please do not make your purchase decisions on that. Just consider the things that are generally available. So with that, the agenda for this session is we're going to go through what is batch, what's synchronous Apex, and what's queuable Apex. We'll see when and why to use them. We'll demo some code for all those three scenarios. We'll go through some design considerations, and I'll show you how to deploy the code, and then I'll leave like 10 minutes for Q&A. By the way, there's a mic on the middle of the aisle, so if you have any questions at the end, just please use the mic. And let's start with a quick survey. So anyone created custom fields on the platform? Cool. Written any type of code? Any code. Okay. Apex code? Okay. Asynchronous, batch. Okay, cool. So this should be useful. So we'll start with some basics just to provide a little bit of context. So we'll go through what's Apex. So basically Apex is just an object-oriented programming language from the Salesforce platform. It's similar to Java syntaxes-wise. But it's written for multi-tenant environments, so meaning that your code won't conflict with some other client's code and stuff like that. Now, another cool thing about Apex is it runs in the cloud. So that's pretty cool. So you deploy it and it runs on hardware that we take care, and you just focus on making your business run way better. It's also closely integrated to data, so it's really simple for you to query for the data on your org and start building controllers and batch processes, stuff like that, just enhancing your applications on the platform. The other thing is it provides a testing framework, so it's really easy for you to write code and also write code that tests your code. So that way when you go to production, you have 100% security that your code is going to operate how you meant it to operate. The other thing is Apex is versioned. So it's backwards compatible. This means right now we're releasing version 37. In the future we'll be going 38, 39, etc. And your code is going to work exactly the same way as it does right now. You won't have to rewrite it. You won't have to worry about, oh my God, they just released version 40 and my code is on version 19. None of that should happen. Okay, we take care of that for you. So the other thing is multi-tenancy. I briefly talked about it. So what is it? Just imagine that we all live on an apartment building and everyone has an apartment. There are certain things that we share in the building. And one example is the washing machine, right? So multi-tenancy is basically me as a tenant, I go, I wash my clothes, and I don't leave them there because I would just be blocking other tenants on the building from using it. What I do is I go there, I wash my clothes, I take them out, and someone else is going to be able to use it after I'm done. That's basically multi-tenancy. It's playing well with others, sharing resources, things like that. So what is asynchronous Apex? It's basically code that executes in the background and without the user having to wait for it to finish. So we're talking about processes that are taking a lot of time while running. Think about you processing thousands of millions of records in your org. You don't want your user to click a button and wait for the screen for like an hour. You just basically want the user to operate and keep on moving. That's a better experience. So the platform gives us a couple of options to do asynchronous processing, which are batch, asynchronous Apex, or also known as future methods or future Apex, and the latest one is queuable Apex. So basically, batch is meant for a large number of records being processed and not on real time. Think about you want to operate on the millions of accounts and contacts that you have on your org. Apex, batch Apex should be a good option for that. if you talk about asynchronous Apex, it's basically something that's near real time, but not really. You want to use future Apex whenever you want to, for example, communicate with a third-party API and just forget about it. You just throw that transaction, and then the other service takes care of it. And queuable Apex is kind of like a marriage between batch and feature. So if they had a baby, that would be queuable Apex, because it's very simple to use, just like feature, but it's also giving you the power of batch to process a lot of records at the same time. And this is good whenever you want to throw a transaction that operates in the background, but you still want to monitor it. Now, a difference between queuable and feature is that on feature, you can only send primitive data types to it. So meaning you send a list of IDs or a list of strings that represent what you want to query and then operate over it. With queuable, you don't do that. With queuable, you could actually send the list of records that you want to operate through it, and then in the future, whenever this is operational, you won't have to query for that data. Now, one consideration when you're building queuable Apex is that if you are sending actual records to it, you gotta make sure that this data is not gonna be stale. Because if you're sending it to the method and then operating over it and saving it, you could potentially have stale data, okay? So let's start with a quick demo. So I built, let's just imagine that we have Spotify running on top of the platform. And Spotify, it's a music streaming service, meaning you have your music online and you just stream it to your device. So let's pretend that it all runs on top of the Salesforce platform and we have the access to the backend. So I have artist data, albums, songs, I have users, I have the relationship with the artist, I have what the user has played over the time, okay? So let's start by creating a new user on the system. So I'm creating Kevin, and he's active, and he wants to enable two-factor authentication on his account. Now, two-factor authentication, it's basically a way to authenticate your account with a second device. So you have a password, and then you probably have a code that gets generated on your phone, something like that. So when a service does this, they need to generate a code, send it to you on your phone, and then you verify the code on the service through a screen, right? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna use future Apex to actually generate a code, send it to the user through a service called Twilio, and then Twilio just handles the transaction of sending them an SMS, and we forget about it. We just assume that the user gets the code and then enters it on the next screen to verify their phone, okay? So when we save this, we see that Kevin was created, I enabled two-factor authentication, and I generated a random code for his account, okay? I actually have well, you can't see my phone, but I got the message. So if we look at the code, the way that I'm executing, and can you see this? Okay, so this is just a trigger on the contact, okay? The first thing that I'm doing is I'm checking, did the user actually enable two-factor authentication? And if it does, then I generate a random code for his account and save it. And then afterwards, if I have a valid code and I haven't sent it, then I call this utility called Twilio util send SMS async, so I can send the code to it. And notice that on the trigger, I'm basically just sending a set of IDs that need to be processed by my future method, okay? So if I go to the future method, this is the utility that I use. The first thing that you'll notice is this annotation, future. This is basically telling the code, hey, this is future Apex. It's gonna execute asynchronously. And the other thing that I added to it is callout equals true. And this is very important if you're doing an integration with a third-party API. So I'm basically telling Apex, hey, I'm gonna do an HTTP callout to some other service, so enable this. So the entry point is the SMS async method. and I receive, as I said, a set of contact IDs that I need to process. And the first thing that I do is I query for all of the data that I need to send via the SMS message. This is because future Apex doesn't allow me to actually send the list of contacts. So the first thing that I need to do is query for all that information. So once I do that, I just process every contact, and I start building the SMS that I'm going to send it to. So this is the method that I use, and I'm relying on the Twilio library, REST library, and I'm basically just building the message payload. So I have who is it going for, is basically the phone number that I enter on the contact, from who it is, which is like me, the system, which is basically I have my data on a custom setting, and I add it to the message, and then I have the body, like, hey, Kevin, use this access code to verify your phone number, stuff like that, and then I just send it through Twilio. And whenever the transaction is processed, I basically wipe out the code, and that's it, and I save it. So this is how future Apex works. Now, let me show you something on batch. So let's say Kevin already received the code, he already authenticated, and he starts playing some music on the service, right? And I'm storing that information on my service. So let's say that he loves R&B, so he likes Miguel. Anyone familiar with him? Well, maybe wrong crowd for this. So I'm storing the artist and the song that he's playing. So he's playing Miguel, and let's say that he's also playing something else. And if you don't know Miguel, you don't know this one. But it's basically a really good band. They're from LA. Oops. Okay. So I save to a couple of artists. Now, Spotify made some headlines when they released this new feature called Discovery Weekly Playlist. And what they did was they basically processed all of the data that they had for the users, and they created a weekly playlist of artists that were similar to what they were playing, which was very cool. But if you think about it, with all of that information, you're not going to be able to just click a button and expect the playlist to be created immediately. You have to process a bunch of records. You have to relate artists with artists that are similar to them, users with the follows that they do, with the plays that they do in a certain period of time. So in this example, what I did was I built an Apex class that's executed through batch, where I basically process all the active accounts, and then I get all of their information. I get all of the artists that they're playing, all of the artists that are similar to the artists that they're playing that they haven't played yet, and I generate a playlist that I assign to them. Okay, so if you think about this is a lot of processing things. So let me just trigger the batch. Oops. So I go to my developer console, and I just trigger my batch for the Discovery Weekly Playlist. So if I go back to Kevin, he should have a playlist already generated for him, which is this one, Discovery Weekly Playlist for Kevin. And if you look at it, you'll see a bunch of artists that he hasn't listened to, right? So he was listening to Miguel and to Warpaint, and all of a sudden I'm saying like, yo, you should listen to Beyonce, you'll like it. Like it's related to Miguel. Or you should listen to the new Frank Ocean record. So let's look at the code for this. So this is batch Apex. The first thing that you'll notice is I give it a name, and then I implement a couple of interfaces. I implement the database batchable interface and the database stateful interface. Okay, this is how the system knows I'm executing batch. And this is how I am able to have global variables and store certain things while the whole batch operation is running. Okay, so I basically want to store how many records have I processed in batch completely. Okay. The second thing is we start with a start method. This is basically the one that's gonna drive the scope of the operation of your data. what I do here is I basically say, bring me all of my contact records that are active. And we're talking about processing up to like 50 million records on a batch operation, on a batch job, okay? So this sets the context and then sends it to the execute method. The execute method is basically just receiving the query locators and the data that you're gonna operate over, meaning I'm gonna operate over the contacts, and you get it on the scope, okay? So the first thing that I start doing is I start iterating over this scope and I start storing data on maps and sets and on lists. And the reason why I do this is because I want to bulkify my code. And this is very important when you're working with batch operations and batch processes. You do not want to write your code in a way that it only handles one record at a time. That's basically just a no. Like, there's no reason why you should do that. You should write your code in a way that you assume that it runs for more than one record at a time, okay? So that's why I start using a lot of lists and maps and stuff like that. So I get the list of contacts, and then I start getting, as I said before, the list of history songs that they've played on the system. Once I do that, I start bringing the artists that are related to the artists that the user has played, and I store them on another map. And once I do that, once I have the list of artists that I know that the user hasn't listened to, I start bringing the songs for those artists so I can start pushing them into a playlist, okay? So once I have all that data, I basically iterate over all the contacts, and I say, okay, this contact hasn't listened to Beyonce, so I'll put a Beyonce song on his playlist. This contact hasn't listened to the Chili Peppers, but he listened to something similar to Chili Peppers, so he must like that. So once I do that and I process every playlist, I store them on a list of playlists, and I just insert them all at once. I don't insert things one by one. I basically do a bulk operation of saves, okay? So then I'm done with the execution of my code. And once I'm done, I want to send the admin that triggered this process an email telling him, hey, the process for the Discovery Weekly playlist has just run. It executed X amount of processes, there were so many failures, and the total amount of records that you processed was whatever you were storing on the record processed variable, okay? So this is how we do batch Apex. Now, let's go back to the system. So I've created a user, I created a Discovery Weekly playlist, and let's say that I also, I have a third-party system where I store information about artists, and then I need to bring it back or bring it into my system. You don't want to do that manually. You want a process that basically just queries this third-party system, brings all the data, and inserts them into the system. But the difference with this is I want to monitor that process. So what we'll do is we'll build some queuable Apex jobs, and we'll do that with the platform. We'll basically communicate with a third-party system, and we'll say, bring me all the new artists that I need to make available to my users, and insert them into the system and make them available, okay? So, again, I open my developer console. Actually, let me show you the current artists, because then you will say, like, it was already there. So, here it is. So if you look at our artists, I have Beyonce, Frank Ocean, Kendrick Lamar, stuff like that, right? And then I'll trigger a process that will bring me new artists into the system. So I open again my console, and I want to execute my queuable job that's called artist data queuable. So I execute this, and if you saw on the code here, I was storing the job ID, and then I was able to query for the status of it and print it. So if I open this log, I should be able to show you the ID for that record. And this is the difference between queuable and future jobs. It's really easy to keep track and monitor the process while it's getting executed. You basically just query for the Async Apex job table on the platform, and that's it. So if we refresh the list of artists, I should see a new one at least. Okay, so Lennon is in. And then if you look at Lennon, I also brought one album from him, Imagine, okay? So let me show you the code to do that. So this is the code for Qable Apex. The first thing that you'll notice is I named it, our artist data Qable, and I'm implementing a couple of interfaces. Qable interface, which basically is saying this is Qable Apex, and then I'm implementing database allowed callouts. So this is very similar to future jobs when you were saying add future callout equals true. I'm basically telling this job is allowed to make HTTP callouts to another service, okay? So another similarity with batch and difference is with batch, let me show it to you. We had start, execute, and finish. Well, this one just has execute, and that's it. So it's simpler to write. And this is completely inherited from batch. So I get my execution method, I get the context, and I basically just start doing the call out to the artist data service that I created. This is basically just a normal HTTP call out to a mock service that I created for this demo. And it should return me a JSON string. So I get the JSON data, I deserialize it, and I start processing this data. So this is a JSON that brings the artists, the albums, the songs, everything on the system. And we're talking about several records here. It's not just one table with all of that information. It's basically a table for the artist, a table for every album, a table for every song, and then everything is related. So when I start deserializing this JSON, I start creating all of these records and putting them into data structures like maps and lists. It's very, very similar to batch, where I'm bulkifying my code. So this is operational on more than one record at a time. And so the first thing that I do is get the artist data, I query through it, I put it on a map, and I insert it, and I save a reference to that artist, because then I need to relate the album with the artist. Then I go back to the JSON payload that I received, and I start processing the albums. I get the year that it was created, the name for it, and which artist it's related to. So I start creating the album record. Here you can see that I'm basically deserializing the name of the album. And from the previous payload of the artist, I basically get the ID of the record of the artist that I just created on my system. And once I'm done with this, I basically just save all of the data into the system. And this is how Qable works. So if we go back to the presentation, so now we have our code ready, right? We have two paths to production or to any other environment for deploying this new code, because we're assuming that you're writing this on a dev or on a sandbox. You want to port it into another environment. So the first one is you use the Salesforce Migration Toolkit, which is basically some jars that you download from your org, then you write ant targets around them, and you deploy it to any environment that you want. The second option is more UI-driven. It's called change sets. So it's basically you go into your org, your development org or your sandbox where you have the code, and you start choosing the changes on the code that you just performed and you want to release. You create this change set, and then you select which org you're gonna deploy to. And once you save that transaction, this message with all this new code goes into this new org, into this other org. And once it gets there, you log into the destination org, and you accept that message, you run the test, and it's completely installed on your org. So that's how you release the code. And this is the final slide. Basically, all the code that I've demoed, it's available on that Git repo. And another thing that you might find useful is going through that Trailhead program. It's basically gone through everything on asynchronous Apex. And with that, that's it. Thank you. And if you have any questions, I'll be around. So the question is, am I going to make the resources available on Chatter? Yes. Once I'm done with this session, I'll post everything on the chatter feed for the session. Yep.
Nothing special about your deploy steps for async batch, right? That's just how you deploy.
The question is, there was nothing special about what, sorry?
Your deploy steps.
My deploy steps? No. There's nothing special about my deploy steps. I'm basically just using everything that's available to you right now. By the way, there's a mic in the middle. If you have any questions, and you can talk through it so everyone can listen.
Now that I don't think it works though.
Is the mic on?
Hello? Hello? Oh, it works,
Yeah.
okay. Well, now that we've learned 3 different techniques,
Yes.
I'd be interested to hear which technique is, how should we find out which technique we should use? Mostly queuable Apex versus batch.
Sure. So, let me show you this slide. So, for example, on the business example, I added certain business cases that might relate to how to choose better which type of technique or process you want to build. Batch is basically very, very useful when you're processing a lot of records and you just want to do the transaction there. Queuable, I think, in my particular opinion, it's better when you're doing callouts and processing a lot of records, and this is because of the callout limit on batch, which basically every execution has a limit of 10 callouts. With asynchronous Apex, it's better for this. It's also better for monitoring the job. And you could also send data to it. So for example, let's say that you want to operate over X amount of contacts. You could query for those contacts and actually send them to the queuable Apex job. With batch, you can't do that. You need to do that through the start method. So it's basically just, you need to look at the pros and cons and what you're trying to build and go from there. There's no, I can't tell you whenever you're doing X type of thing, you only need to use batch. It's more of what you're trying to build and how every option adapts to or complies to what you're trying to build.
Yeah, that was something that was interesting to hear, but yeah, thanks.
Okay.
In your test code, I've run into some issues where code coverage, it won't let you run batches and things like that when you're doing Apex tests. How do you
Correct.
work around that?
So when you're writing tests for batch, and I didn't have enough time to show you tests because there were a lot of options, a lot of code to cover. But basically, when you're running or when you're creating a test for a batch job, the assumption is that you only do one batch execution. Okay, so meaning when you're creating a test, you create test data, right? And then you run your process. So let's say that in this code that I showed you, I was executing 200 records at a time. Let's just bring it down a little, and let's say that my batch only operates over 2 records. If I create test data for 4 records, and then I trigger my batch, it'll error because batch will try to operate over 4 records, which are two batch transactions. Right? So whenever you're writing the code for test, just make sure that your batch is going to operate once, and it should go through.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, hi. Yeah, this has come up in a couple other sessions around async. But let's say that you did an async call to Twilio and that failed. Mm-hmm. Like they were rolling something out or the network was down or something. What are the options for doing a retry?
So, for example, if you need to do the error handling on the Salesforce side and not on the third-party side, then probably queuable would be a good option because you can monitor the job and you can basically see whether the transaction was successful or not. in my example, I was basically relying on Twilio to be successful on the service. And normally when we present on services a two-factor authentication screen, if you don't get the code in X amount of time, they normally have a button to resend, stuff like that. If it was a different type of transaction where you must make sure that the transaction was successful, then probably queuable is a good option because you could monitor it.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Hi, I have a question. When we have like thousands of records to send to external system as a REST callout, but the external system doesn't accept more than a certain limited number of records, how do we approach that to avoid hitting the limits?
The limits of the third system or the third-party system, or the limits of the platform?
Salesforce. So each callout accepts a certain number of records to be processed, but we need to do that external call for each record like on a daily basis to sync the system.
So you're syncing from the external system into Salesforce, or
Yes.
from the external into Salesforce?
Yes.
Okay, so it depends on the amount of records that you're trying to process. If you do it with batch, every batch execution, let's say that you want to sync data from your third-party system into your Salesforce contacts, and you have 1,000 contacts, right? And your system is only able to send you 10 records at a time, okay? So if you build it with batch, batch has the limit of every execution can only process 10 HTTP callouts, right? So that means that on your execute, you're gonna do 10 callouts into your service and then re-execute the batch job, okay? And you basically just tell the batch, hey, you just operate over 10 records at a time, okay, for the whole records that I have on my org. If that's not enough, you could try queuable, but really this seems to be a limitation with the third-party system, and we give you options, but it basically depends on the limits that you have on your business case. As I said, like, you could do it with batch and it might be okay for you because it allows you to do 10 HTTP callouts. If that's not enough, you could try queuable, and that might sort things out. The only thing that I would say is you should be careful with how many callouts you do, because there's certainly a limit of how many callouts you can do per day at the platform level, at the org level.
Thank you.
Sure.
I know that you talked a lot about batch, but you haven't got a chance to talk about scheduling, batch jobs, cron jobs, and so on and so forth. So I'm wondering what are the options for there, and whether some of the options can be done through the setup menu in Salesforce, and some of them can be written in code Apex.
Right. So it was intentional not talking about scheduled jobs. And the reason for that is when you schedule something, you want to leverage batch jobs or queuable jobs that you've previously written, right? So scheduled jobs are basically just another interface that you implement on the platform, and you just say, like, hey, I want to execute this batch job at a certain point of time and just queue it. You can do that through code, and you can monitor it through the setup screens. There's I think the menu is setup, and then you go to asynchronous jobs or some, I don't remember exactly the name for it, but that's how you do it. And I mean, the reason why I didn't talk about it was I personally think that it's important to first know these three ways of writing asynchronous operations, and then just scheduling them, it's very simple. You basically leverage what you wrote on batch or queuable and just call it from the cron job or your schedule job.
So cron job, do you always have to start it in like a console, or it's something that can be like, how do you set off the schedule to like run? Do you just set it once, and how do you stop it from?
It depends. So you need to state on the cron job how you want it to run. You could say, I want it to run till 2050 every Friday night at 10 a.m. Eastern. the way that I've done it is you can do it through the console, just like I did the firing of the Apex and the queuable, or you could basically create a Lightning component that on the background has a controller that schedules this for you. So basically you just create a small component that communicates to Apex and just triggers the scheduling of this job in case it's not scheduled already.
All right, thank you.
Sure.